few things to announce. One is it's freezing in here, which I just taught in this room from 4 to 6:30, and I left as an iceberg. So I might suggest you wear your jacket and your hat, or your Captain America outfit, or whatever it is you're dressed as.
Very good.
It's nice to see the festive outfits today. And I'm sure you're thrilled to have more art theory and visiting artists tonight, and then my class to 10:30. Then I'll let you out at 9:29 and 59 seconds for you to go out into the world and enjoy Halloween. So let me highlight a couple of visiting artists coming up before Marta introduces our guest tonight. We have tonight included 3 visiting Artist Now lectures in a row. So tonight, Cima Katz will present. She's come from Lawrence, Kansas, so we're very honored to have her here and present her work. Next week, we have Hans Gindelsberger, which the art students, that should be a familiar name. Hans was a fantastic photography teacher, professor, and he is showing in the Knoll Show right now. So many of you know Hans, and we'll be excited to hear his lecture next week. And then 2 weeks, Emmanuel Pratt is presenting from Chicago. And his work is really, really interesting. It merges art and urban farming and transforming neighborhoods, primarily in Chicago's South Side. So we have 3 Artist Now talks in a row starting tonight, and then Xavier Tobas is presenting on November 28th to close out the semester. And then we get it all rolling in the spring semester as well. And there's some good news. We're adding 2 lectures to the spring calendar as well. So we'll have a nice full schedule next semester as well. So please join us. And I should note that Marquette University has been doing a fantastic job. And some of you saw Elizabeth Subrin's lecture. Their next lecture series is featuring Michael Ray Charles. In the world of painting, this is one of the absolute giants. A huge, huge name in painting. And his work is really interesting. It looks primarily at issues of race, which my course probably assigned because we talk about issues of race in every class, right? Which is good, which is important. But Michael Ray Charles is a key figure in American painting. And he's presenting, he's in conversation with Dr. Travis Dixon on Thursday, November 8th at 6 p.m. at Strauss Hall, room 105 at Marquette, with a reception to follow. So try to make that. I'll post that information on our website for this class, but I'm sure there's going to be a buzz in the air because it's rare that a artist that is one of the highly recognized painters working anywhere in the country, in the world, is coming to Milwaukee. So at any rate, I will try to de-thaw, and let's have a nice follow-up conversation with our artists. We haven't had a visiting artist for a couple weeks, but the conversations that happen are so key. So Marna shall introduce our guest, who has a fabulous costume. So does Marna.
Hey, Walgreens half price.
You don't want to.
No, everybody knows I talk to them, but anyway. It's really my pleasure tonight to introduce Cima Katz to you. Cima and I have known each other now, we figured it out, 35 years. I, in a previous life, taught at the University of Kansas. It was my first job out of graduate school. And Cima came there a year after I did, and she is still there. She is still there. Cima is from New York and did her BFA at Carnegie Mellon University and her MFA at Indiana University, and is a trained printmaker. That in a lithographer, fair to say, is her background, and was hired at KU as a lithographer. She now teaches in an area called expanded media, and you'll see the sort of transition when she shows her work between her more traditional printmaking and where it's gone over the years. I don't know how many of you have gotten over to see the show that Ben Sargent and I curated at Villa Terrace. That is one of the reasons that Cima's here. If you get a chance, the show is up until the middle of January. All we've got Garden of Curious Delights, and Cima is a rather special participant in that exhibition as well. She has shown her work nationally and internationally at various museums, and has done residencies and is in collections at the National Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C., the Chicago Art Institute, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, I can probably mispronounce that, Ewing Gallery, Utah Museum of Fine Arts, Huntsville Museum of Art, on and on and on, Aberdeen Art Gallery in Aberdeen, Scotland. And it's more than a pleasure to introduce my old buddy, Cima Katz.
Do we have to do profile kisses with them? But before I start, the one thing I want to mention is I think there's a mistake on this graph. This should say age of entitlement. Hi. Oh, man, we have bubble gum for everybody too, so maybe we should just pass that around. I want to throw it, but they told me that that would be lawsuit material. So, I was looking for
Bubble gum is
softer
the perfect
candy.
thing to have in this place.
Don't you think? And just don't promise me you won't chew it and then stick it under the seat. Why don't you guys start it, you go that way, you go that way, just send it. There's a little huddled board in the back there. Okay, I'm going to talk, I'm going to ramble, I can tend to go all over the place. We'll just see how this goes. In the short time, I'd like to provide a little insight. I gotta take this off. Maybe I'll put it back on when it gets really serious again. I'd like to provide a little insight into my long-time studio practice, and a slightly more extensive glance into what I consider still an ongoing body of work. Oh, by the way, that's a lover's eye. It's called the lover's eye. And it's a piece of either, and I don't know which this one is, Edwardian or Victorian jewelry in the court, in both in France and in England, where it was really common for the courtesans to take on lovers. They would have a little eye painted and wear it. It was like a little tease. It wasn't, you couldn't tell who it really was. The whole truth wasn't there, but there was all of this underlying implication. And it's almost a metaphor for everything that I'm thinking of doing in my work, really all the way back to the beginning. This is a mailbox from Howard Finster, the very, very well-known American outsider artist who I wish was still alive. And that whole idea of transporting, of going from one place to another, to me is what making art does for me. The act of making, being in the studio, I'm transported, and it's what I hope my work can do for other people when they look at it. I'm a voracious collector of everything, like many artists are, both physical and metaphysical. Oftentimes what I collect is only valuable to myself. I'd like to point out that the way each artist sees the world is unique, and how we interpret it is perhaps even more so. I do have a kind of peculiar sense of humor, or perhaps irony that filters all of my experiences. This was an Easter display in an underwear store in Aberdeen, Scotland. Hot cross buns and crotchless panties. I've always said that given my druthers I'd be a photographer, but that I can't resist messing around with things. Besides, I'm really a B-flat photographer. And I prefer to see the world without the rectangular box between me and it. I have always and continue to be obsessed with liminal space. And this image on your left is perhaps my favorite photograph ever. It was when my dog Tuna Fish was giving birth to her puppies early in the morning on New Year's Day, and I was lucky enough to get to watch, and that little guy, his sack didn't break. We had to break it for her so that she could lick him clean. And this is a blown glass bubble that was blown thin enough that it didn't need to go into an annealer. There's something magic about how this light in these objects provides the identifying nature of the thing. So what is real and what is imagined, in this case space, plays a large part in what a piece is about. In this one and another work like it, in this case, this is a very flattened space, which is typical of my work. Notice the repetition of mark making that's going to continue, and that sense of glimmering light. This is about a 4-foot square mixed media piece. I'm not big on giving names and that kind of identifying information. I'll give you basic sizes, and if something changes, I'll let you know. My works are often very direct responses to something specific, but it's not really important that you know the story. I've always wanted the viewer to bring their own experiences to the table. I will tell you some of the stories, however. This is a call for Donna Margarita and What Might Have Been, and it was generated from a really tiny little newspaper clipping about an 85-year-old woman in Mexico who had surgery, and they found a fossilized fetus in her uterus. She had to have a hysterectomy, and she had obviously remained childless. And I was very moved by it. I've always been very conscious of the huge variety of book forms out there, perhaps because, above all, I'm a storyteller. And from the beginning, I've slyly inserted references to text directly into the work. I'm going to include some old lithographs here to keep the printmakers happy. These are all multiple stone lithos with lithographic maps. Again, that sense of liminal but flattened space. They're around 2 feet by 2 feet. I've generally always worked in a series like this. However, they're not necessarily, they don't need to be seen together. This is called Play Strawberry Deep. It's kind of timely. It's from a World Series when the Yankees, for a change, were in the series, and this Darryl Strawberry that I was referring to. Probably you guys weren't born yet. Under the category Shit Happens, a series of injuries forced me to suspend my lithographic practice. I gave myself a summer in a new studio space with new materials and the job to not make art, but rather to play and explore. The result was a multi-year drawing exploration that responded to this small newspaper image of a Titan nuclear missile on a submarine that had exploded underwater and made this, what to me is an extraordinarily beautiful mark in the sky. The larger concern is the idea of terrible beauty. Our attraction to the horrible, obscene, troubling. The fact that there are two sides to every story. Mirror images, doppelgangers, hay bales and missile trails. The energy employed to make these drawings couldn't have been more different from the careful control of color lithography. The paper was taped to the wall, and these are about 4 feet square, these square ones. I was standing, really dancing while I drew. My entire body was engaged with the process of making these pieces. bales grew to become anthropomorphic, so these are more or less the size of me. And when they're exhibited, they're anchored to the floor so that human scale and size is really apparent, or hopefully is. If you look carefully, you'll notice there's little human parts inside of them. And then the round bales became a series of X's and O's that was installed this way, hugs and kisses, if you will. So you can see how that initial idea naturally started to metamorphose. When I went back into the printmaking studio, it was to a monotype process. These are one-off prints, and they are in direct response to the hay bales. However, the specific reference that I was interested in were cairn markers. Cairn is a Gaelic word. You find cairns on hiking trails so that you can find your way. They're historically little piles of rocks that are human-made. I think perhaps they're precursors to grave markers, or that's what they started out to be, actually. The intense energy of making these prints, and these are pretty large, they're 4 by 6 feet, was directly related to that physical drawing activity. And, oops, wrong way. Eventually, the landscape that I was pulling the cairns out of basically took over. The work became very heavily layered with transparent marked papers, and the visual result was not predetermined but allowed to develop as the papers were printed on, and there were sheets of marks and sheets of colors, and things were torn and played with throughout the process. They became very delicate and object-like. They were shown without a framing device. They're probably the only thing I ever made that sold like hotcakes. But truth be told, I was really done with the conceptual and technical challenges. So this has just been a taste of what I was involved in earlier in my career. Around the same time, my mother decided to clean house. For her, that meant attempting to recreate history by throwing out all of the family photographs. When she offered me a small bundle of what remained, this photograph was included. I had never seen it before. I had never been told the story. It's an image of my maternal grandfather's family in Eastern Europe, which was brought over by the one other son who emigrated. The rest were all extinguished in the Holocaust. Part of my history was robbed, and part of my history previously unknown was re-gifted. This happened at the same time that I was sitting down to work with Photoshop for pedagogical reasons, and it's turned out to be a great relationship. It's interesting to me to note how sometimes ideas just naturally metamorphose, how other times it's a direct decision to explore a different path, and still other times opportunities just present themselves for a variety of reasons at the right moment. This is one of the first images that I feel still holds up in the body of work as I started to work with Photoshop, and I will tell you, I started when there were no layers in the program. Any of you who use Photoshop? And I believe there were 32 megabytes of RAM on my computer. So I would sit and read a chapter of a book while something transformed. And when I got 64 megabytes of RAM, it was a big deal. And you think about that now, and it's just unbelievable. Things have changed pretty fast. So as I began to use this program for more than just teaching reasons, I began to take notice of all of my own weird bad snapshots that never made sense to anyone else, of crumbling walls. I started to scan things in my immediate environment, and as I said, I'm an inveterate collector, so there was lots of stuff to scan. Text became actual. For example, notes, memos, journal pages. The different physical handwriting became different voices in the work. If I want you to read them, you will be able to as we go through these images. If I don't want you to read them and really mean them as background chatter, you'll know that too. All of these earlier images are 22 by 30 unless otherwise stated. They're digitally printed on an archival coated heavy rag paper, and I consider them prints. Why I responded to Photoshop, besides the conceptual reasons at the time, it's the ultimate collage making tool. If you're interested in collage at all, it's collage heaven. You can have some precious little thing that you find, and you can make infinite numbers of them. You can change their size, you can change their color, you can skew them, you can distort them, you can repeat them, you can make a pattern out of them, and you still have the original. So that idea of developing collage where a personal alphabet, which I had always used in certain images, which tended to repeat themselves in my drawings or repeat themselves in my prints, could continue to do that even more so in this process. Also, once Photoshop got layers, the layering in Photoshop, for me, was just a mirror image of the way I used layering as I developed color lithographs. So I consider these prints. The program allowed me to integrate many things from my thoughts in life. It's a very holistic experience, and it continues to be. Looking back at this work, it's obvious that some of the pieces have direct references to mourning and to death, but at the time, what I was consciously focused on was the idea of family stories and family truths, stemming from that incident with my mother. And that idea of somebody attempting to rearrange their own family history. It's like the game of telephone when somebody whispers something in the next person's ear and it goes around a circle, and when it comes back it's something completely different. People do this for different reasons. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's not. But the reality is that there's no truth about the nooks and crannies of the past. Somebody passes away and the stories die with them. Somebody tells a little white lie to make themselves look a little better, and all of a sudden, you know, the whole history of Uncle Frank changes. We all have different reasons for embellishing or cleansing what we learn. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's political, among other things. What is absent is as important as what is present. The color sensibility of all of these images is very deliberate. Old, musty, frayed, faded, almost a burned at the edges feeling. There is a concentration on human interactions and communication, or the lack thereof. All of these works have no surface other than the printed digital collage, and that was a very conscious decision because I felt that the actual artist's hand might be a bit too much. I wanted the subversive beauty that drew you to the image to remain such that the viewer would come up close to it and confront the sometimes difficult subject matter. I didn't want an active surface to distract them from that. This is a decision that I eventually came to reverse in later work, but it holds true for what I have been showing you and will show you for a little while. The best comment I think that I've ever received was from somebody I didn't know at an exhibition opening, and they told me they felt like they'd been in there peeking in my dresser drawers and in my closet. And I said, did you have permission? And they said, oh yeah, I had permission. I wasn't sneaking, but it was very personal and felt very strange. And that's pretty much exactly what I would like you to do as you look at these works. All of the human elements are actually family members of mine, but it's not important that you know literally who they are. The other photographs are all mine, taken from that hugely maligned, ever-growing stack of close-ups of crumbling walls, and other textures that I started to look for, and objects that I started to look for and photograph. Once I became committed to this process, I also continued to scan objects in my house, and to my friends' dismay, in their houses and on their bodies and anything and everything else that I was interested in. It's really become, as I mentioned, this really holistic process. My art in my life really kind of came together in a way. So the resulting work has created a pseudo-historical narrative about family. It all has a melancholic atmosphere. Numerous of the images incorporate virtual books. Remember, I am a storyteller. The narrative shifts language, periods of time or place, implying but never stating specific facts. This piece is called To Be Gone. Everyone has an Aunt Lily and an Aunt Rose, or their equivalent. Mine were each born as a twin, but each one of their twins died, and so they became each other's twin. They never lived apart, they never married. What I'm interested in is a kind of duality of identity. I have taken digital images back into lithography occasionally. I found a way to do it that interests me vis-a-vis the nature of lithography and the nature of the way that I use Photoshop. I'm not interested in making color photo separations like you would for a magazine or a newspaper. This triptych was done for an American lithographers exhibition at the National Print Museum in Buenos Aires. The top portions are each 4-color lithographs, and the bottom are digitally collaged sections. As I continued in the studio, some other issues in my personal life caused me to shift focus. Specifically, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. As her memory literally disintegrated, I came to view a lot of the ideas I had been dealing with differently. The work became focused on the conversation between two people. It added a certain kind of poignancy and timeliness to the work, I think. Within the narrative, there is a specific focus on my mother, the center of the drama, for better or worse. The screen becomes split as words fall on ears that cannot understand. But larger questions really drive the work. Wounds can be mental or emotional as well as physical. As certain parts of us disintegrate, other parts are allowed to flourish for the first time, perhaps. You will have noticed hands, hopefully, over and over in my work. It's always been so, even back when I was making lithographs and drawings. Perhaps because of that wrist injury that ended my lithographic practice. More likely because for me, hands are the equivalent of eyes, windows to the soul. I've always joked that we spend 2/3 of our adult life getting over our childhood, and I truly believe that it is very difficult work to heal the scars of our experience. In some ways, on a personal level, I think this work is an attempt to pick at the scabs, but also to celebrate the many small joys that are also contained in a life. In hindsight, it feels like a long and lovely dance around the head of a pin. This piece is entitled Death Ship. As stated earlier, the relationship between image and text has been inherent to my process for a long time. I've used found family writings from my own journals, and writing done specifically for a particular piece. It's the concept of language as a form of communication or lack thereof that is as interesting to me as any specific phrase that might be readable within the work. I also use writing as a creative tool to challenge or forward my studio practice. Because of the more recent research I've been doing, I've become very interested in found text as well as found images. I've tended toward the sentimental. The more schmaltzy, the better. I've been borrowing, appropriating, stealing like crazy. As the recognizable vestiges of my mother's personality truly slipped away, I knew that I would begin dealing with death directly in the studio, though the process has been very different than I could have ever imagined. I began working with multiple panels, and the scale became much more intimate. And I started allowing my hand to resurface within the work using a variety of physical collage elements to dance with the virtual collage. I also became interested in the dance between printed paper and printed fabric. Fabric is a work surface and is a reference within the images, and started incorporating a relationship between the two. I played with various references that fabric implies: women's work, shrouds, curtains, texture of life, fundamental structure. And so I have been moving between the two surfaces, printing cloth images on fabric, making fabric work like paper, enjoying the trompe-l'oeil issues that are raised. I've explored rituals surrounding death in many cultures and during many different times in history. It's been a very spiritual and meditative journey for me. I think that this work in many ways is really about looking inward and making peace with oneself. It's about accepting who we are and who we are not. That may sound like a leap from addressing issues related to morbidity, but I don't think it is. And it is the honest feeling that I have as the artist making this work. In hindsight, to me, it's clearly an ongoing self-portrait. This is 4 panels. Oh, wait a minute, I got messed up here again. This is the way this piece actually shows, but it's so difficult because it's about 6 feet long that I just tried to put it in slightly different ways so you could get a feeling for what was happening on the surfaces and more specifically really start to see some of the beading and the paper collage, etc. I've also become very interested in creating direct references to old cabinets of curiosities, collections of world wonders built for wealthy Europeans that are recognized as the precursors to our modern concept of a museum. The aesthetic of the time was obviously different. Artist, time, sense of place are not represented in a linear manner. I've been taking risks in different ways than I ever have before, and am involved as much with the process as with the product. I continue to hoard found images for inspiration or for direct inclusion. My personal collections have crept, well, more than crept, into the studio. My hair collections are a great example. And here's a peek into my wonderful studio that I built about 15 years ago out in the countryside where I live with my dogs and cats and chickens and a variety of uninvited critters, including deer, wild turkeys, blue herons, raccoons, and the occasional skunk. I was talking to somebody about a rattlesnake this afternoon also, but I'm not going to go there. The space itself has grown to harbor my collections and has become a source of inspiration for me, for the work. I've been developing a group of artifacts of varying sizes and materials with the intention for them to create a sense of place or memory that will physically envelop the audience. You'll not be able to read exactly what you see. Rather, the objects will represent or represent a past life. This piece is called Forensic Evidence. And it's about 20 feet long. I'm going to show you a few close-ups of it. My hunting and gathering instincts have totally taken over at this point. I want the work to suggest that things in this life were made of and provide opportunities for introspection, interpretation, and ultimately intuitive recognition. As a group of objects, I want them to suggest a kind of forensic psychological hunt intended to create a sense of collective memory. Enough. Please remember that individual parts signify ephemeral remnants, the detritus, leftovers, and remains that can provide evidence of a life lived. I'm interested in developing a sense of substantiation with the accumulation of altered objects as they relate to one another. Like memory, this work is meant to be fluid, temporal, shadowy, and ambiguous. This is the core of a large project called Vanitas, and this, like several of the last recent ones, are in the exhibition at the Militaris Museum. This is a wall of oval images. There are over 60 of them. It took me somewhere between 3 and 4 years to make this piece. Each one of the images has been digitally developed and printed specifically for old, mostly metal frames that I acquired on eBay. Each of the images has been physically manipulated as well. This is a mock-up of the original digital images of Vanitas, just to get an idea of what this was going to be like. It's pretty overwhelming for me. The images are meant to be seen as a whole, kind of like a jumble of stuff you might find in a young boy's pocket when he empties his pockets and all this junk falls out. I mean, it tells you about his day. It might not tell you specifically, but you learn some things about it. One has to be willing to take some time and make the connections between things that are in one piece, from one piece to the other, in order to begin to understand or create meaning from it. And I'm just going to show you a few of the close-ups. Remember, this is prior to any physical manipulation. And this is the actual piece as it hangs on the wall. It's about 9 feet long and about 7 feet to the top. And pretty much impossible to photograph. And these are some stills from it, some small pieces from it. These next couple of images are installation shots of a work called Flotsam and Jetsam, an amalgamation of odd medical things that I found and altered, as well as vaguely medical parts that I've accumulated at home over the years. And these are also in the museum, the Militaris Museum, in a very different format, in a very different feeling. On the bottom here are codex pages. They're digitally printed and physically altered book signatures. Each one is about 3 by 4 feet, and they're sitting out from the wall on shelves. Above them are the beauties, which are 5 appropriated and altered post-mortem baby images. Which brings us pretty much full circle to a paraphrased Andre Bazin quote, which links, quote, art to embalming, unquote. He calls it, quote, part of a mummy complex that is a defense against the passage of time, unquote. So thanks for inviting me here to UWM. Thank you for coming tonight and putting up with this cold. And I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And that's it. Go for it. Nothing? Yes?
For your piece, Helping Hands, was there a reason you chose the body part of hands instead of maybe like eyes or ears?
I talked about my own perception of hands, that I see hands a similar way to the way eyes are often talked about. I mean, historically, they're called the window to the soul. For me, hands are, they're what we make art with. It's a very, from the very beginning, they're what mothers hold their children with. And I'm saying that as a woman that never had children. They're how we hug each other. They're a particular way that we experience the world, that sense of touch that I want to honor. And it's really an intuitive response. It's not an intellectual decision to use hands. It's just an obsession with them, basically. I think, I don't know if you guys ever played this game. If you were forced to lose one of your 5 senses, which one would you give up? Sight, sound, taste, smell, touch? I hope no one ever has to answer that question, or is put in that position. But that sense of touch to me is as vital, certainly, as any of the others. I guess that's the best way I can answer that.
Was there any reason in particular that they all seem to be like younger hands, or is that just the dogs you happen to have?
Are you talking about the little gold hands?
Yeah. Infants?
Well, if you think about the whole body of work, there's all different kinds of hands in the work. I mean, there are adult hands, there are deformed hands, there are particular hands that belong to particular people, there are symbolic hands, there are hand images that come out of other cultures. But anytime I see hands, there's something that I notice. And at that point, and I've sort of let up lately, but I have a feeling it's going to start again, eBay was my new best friend. I started by looking for those frames, and then started kind of traveling around, and I found those are all old doll hands. And they're beautiful, and they're broken. Most of them, when you see them, I'm not interested in new ones. They're not deformed. I guess maybe a doll person would say they are, and they need to be fixed. But they're busted up, and to me, that age on them made them feel especially lovely. Most of them, don't have all 5 of their fingers. And they came from an object that they're no longer attached to. They're kind of detached and floating or traveling. And I wanted to fix them. I wanted them, and I wanted to fix them. I wanted to make them beautiful again, but in a different way. So, I mean, those hands are, they're all gold leaf with 22 karat gold. And the part on the top is a really particular shade of red sealing wax. And the reference of the gold and red is to groups of Buddhas that I was lucky enough to see when I was in China for a month a number of years ago. So that reference comes to a travel experience. And perhaps some people looking at that would recognize that, or maybe they didn't put it together, but if they've been to China and seen those gold Buddhas and that red lacquer, they'd sit here and do this. I mean, there's so many, when you work, there are so many different layers in the artist's mind, in any piece, that, certain things are more for me or for the artist to, it sort of jogs us along, keeps us engaged. But ultimately, the piece takes on its own kind of meaning. And it doesn't necessarily, all of those things aren't necessarily obvious in there. The other thing about the doll hands, and this is just that stray research that you find out, there's this whole community of doll reborning. Okay, it's not political, it's just about people that are insanely involved with dolls. And they reborn them. And I got really interested in that whole notion, boy. Cake decorators are another thing. Start getting on some cake decorating websites and you'll come up for air in about 5 days. But that whole reborning thing with dolls and the care people take and the hospitals and the personalities that I picked up on, even on these eBay sale sites. The doll people are particular kinds of people. So I got really invested and involved with that whole thing. And I can tell you, if the doll people knew what I did to these hands, they would die. I don't want them to. I have nothing against them. I tended to, if I could tell, you sort of, any of you eBay people besides Marna, don't you dare raise your hand. And I taught her everything I knew. Anybody else into eBay? You do get to know certain personalities of the people you're bidding against, particularly if you're working in a certain area. And if I sensed somebody was really interested in it for the purpose of dolls, I tended to back off of things. Besides, I was interested in the broken ones, and the things that are going to be the most valuable to them are less broken things. So, I mean, it's not that I don't have some that are pretty perfect. I occasionally even break fingers off on purpose. Yes?
You had mentioned, your mother being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Do you think that the sort of going through things and getting rid of things earlier before that had anything to do with later being diagnosed with that? Do you think that was kind of like a precursor?
I think she probably already had Alzheimer's, but hadn't been diagnosed yet. I don't know, it was about, I'd have to think, I'm going to say around 5 years, because it was several years before she sold the house. I mean, her thing was about, she was still living in the house I grew up in, and she was sort of working up to leaving that house. And that was a summer she spent, going through the basement and reliving her life and not being very happy about certain things that had happened in it. And in truth, that nature of her was always there. I started finding out stories, things that I grew up believing that had been completely fabricated or distorted. I mean, that was just the way she dealt with her world. It was the way she was able to deal with what she considered blows in her world. That's between her and her, you know. I mean, there wasn't a lot of crossover where there were a lot of things that did affect me, but generally speaking, those weren't some of them. That particular one really got me, though. And I knew it was happening. And I had to make a decision to either go and confront her, and then that would have been the end of our relationship, or let her do it. And it was really interesting because once this circle was sort of completed and I was given this small packet of photographs, and I told the rest of my family, stuff started pouring in from my cousins, from my father who had left the home 25 years before that. Without much, but anything anybody had just came, got sent to me, so that that's how I had as many photographs as I did.
Yeah, I just find it really interesting, like it's almost ironic that happened, and then sort of, afterwards the memories started going. It's interesting, and how it shows up in the work as well. It's very interesting.
Yeah,
It's from
she's
similar experiences. It's interesting.
That maybe she couldn't tolerate having the memories anymore. Is that what you're saying?
Well, just like the fact that like herself is like getting rid of the memories, but then later on, she can't help but lose the memories.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
There's an irony involved there.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering, in reference to your work in Photoshop versus your lithography, and how hands-on versus digital, if you notice a different appreciation for those, the difference in those, and then what those appreciations that you feel that you might notice in your viewers might have.
I can't answer for the viewers. I'd be interested what you think. As far as, that's a question I've been asked before, especially early on when Photoshop wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And it's not just Photoshop, it's Instagrams and all of the stuff that I don't know anything about because I'm an old person. That transfer of information everywhere. For me, I never felt that physical separation as opposed to the hands-on. That's what I assume you're talking about, that you're drawing on the stone and I remember the gum Arabic. I mean, the feeling of that slick, slimy, wonderful gum Arabic, and on this really smooth, cold stone. And if I wasn't in a rush, which wasn't too often, my hands could just get lost in that and move around in that feeling. And this goes back to the hand question. That feeling of touch. But there's still a very strong separation in printmaking, first of all. You draw on one surface, and it's a matrix only. It's not a product. And you print it on a piece of paper. There is that separation. And if you're printing in color, each one of those colors, except where they print on top of each other, you might have 6 stones or plates, and each one has part of an image on it. It's been taken apart. It's almost a mathematical kind of a thing that happens. It's a way of thinking that I don't think I realized for a very long time until afterwards. But I would start with an image, then I would take it apart. I would deconstruct it and have the different parts on different stones, and then it would all end up getting put back together on a piece of paper, and the stones would get ground down. They wouldn't exist anymore. And the way it got put together was very different from whatever was in my head. So there was a real separation there, although it was a very physical process. And I did like the physical process, but I also did some serious harm to myself at a pretty young age. I had repetitive motion injury in my wrists. I couldn't even lift a frying pan for about 3 years. I had torn rotator cuffs. I just tend to overdo things, you know? So, you know, printing every day with a roller that's heavy and this far apart. I mean, my arms were shut. I couldn't put clothes on. I had to stop. The Photoshop for me, and you know, it just is what it is, but I was lucky in that when I started really working on it, I had a friend who was ahead of me in it, David Keister. And I talked to him and I said, okay, what do I need here? And he said, get 2 screens. One screen is for your image. The other screen has all of your tools on it, so you're not constantly having to go back and forth. You have that image in front of you. Get a Wacom tablet, so you can draw. So from the very beginning, I've had a drawing tool and a tablet kind of set up at an angle, not that different from the way I generally drew or painted on a board. And I'm using photographs, but at the same time, my hand is working and I'm looking at this screen, and I just never felt that separation. I know other people have. I just never did. And as time has gone on, and I've been lucky enough to get larger and larger screens, not as large as I'd like, I'd say the biggest problem with it is you don't really see the whole thing at once. So in order to see, well, it's not a print, but in order to see the kind of detail and what's going on in one small part, you have to zoom in. So you can't see the whole image anymore. And you can see what's happening right there. Then you have to zoom back out so you can see the whole thing. So not unlike printmaking, you don't really see the whole thing until it's printed out on a piece of paper. And then you might have to go back and change a bunch of stuff. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, that you never really felt that disconnect.
Yeah. The physical activity on this, you know, just the physicality of it, but since, you know, it's been a number of years now that I've been working more physically, and I think, you know, part of that was for intellectual reasons, conceptual reasons. Part of it is because I need to start moving again. So, you know, I'm back into a studio dance. I kind of go back and forth between working on the computer and going into the studio, and the computer is not in my studio on purpose. It's in a part, you know, away in my house. Anybody else?
Cima, will you talk about the codex pieces, please? Just describe them as objects.
Physically?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, and then what you were thinking about with them. Because in
okay.
some of them you reference books in
Yeah.
the prints, but they aren't physical books, but the codex
Right.
pieces read as books.
Right, they do, and I've referenced books and storytelling and all of that for years, so I really wanted to make an object. I'm really interested, you know, in a lot of this stuff, in getting away from making this into a piece of paper that hangs on the wall. So just sort of as a precursor, I don't have glass in front of anything anymore. Even old pieces that I've shown in new contexts, I pull the glass out from them. So I have used those book images. I'm very interested in them. I teach a class called The Artist Book, which I've taught for a number of years now. I don't teach how to make physical books. I'm not teaching the craft of bookmaking, the fine craft of bookmaking. Cimas and 1/32 of an inch don't go well together. It ain't gonna happen. But I wanted a book-like object. So, I mean, really, that print, I mean, it's a little bit longer than this, but the 2 sides of it were printed on one long piece of paper. And I knew I was going to do this with it, so there was a blank black strip in the center that I would get rid of and put the 2 ends. And then I simply, when that surface was printed, I took it and folded it with the image in, and I sewed it. And then, I mean, it's not the right proportions, but when it sits, that paper's heavy enough that it just naturally makes that book-like fold. And and it's out. I'm actually working on a whole bunch of Giotto blue ones now. Can't wait. With hands and frozen charlottes, which are little dolls that are dug up in Germany from the late 1800s. Very strange little things. But yeah, that's the basic format of them, and they sat on a shelf. This is really bad, but they sit on a shelf. They're kind of, they have a, I actually put a little piece of metal in that spine, and so that it can stick into a hole in the shelf at the bottom and lean against the wall, so it's kind of, it leans away so it becomes even more object-like. And then those surfaces, I work back into those surfaces, so there's a lot of netting on there and actual cicada wings and dried flowers and drawing and some gold leafing and other kinds of things that happen on those surfaces. What are they about? Really, they're about death. They're just like everything else. They're about death. They're not a dissimilar story to the piece that's called Unfinished Journeys that was the 4 squares on the wall. Some of the images are similar. But I moved on. There were a lot of there's a lot of Victorian mourning jewelry images in those. So, I mean, really rambling, musing stuff. Sorry, I can't do more, Dennis.
Thanks.
Anything else? Yeah.
I was just curious, I think you partially answered this with the other guy's question, but I'm just curious about the process going from Photoshop to a print, or when you print it out. Because don't you print it out in like a big size?
Yes.
So do you have to get like a huge printer? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're going to print it out big, yes.
Okay.
When I started, I was using what are called iris printers that were, and really, when I got serious about this was when I found some way to output it that made sense to me. I mean, 8.5 by 11 off of a, crappy Epson thing wasn't going to do it for me. So I saw, a couple of these gorgeous prints, and I was like, okay, now I can get serious about this. So I used to go up to Des Moines to a professional printer that did a lot of stuff for Las Vegas slot machines, but he liked artists. And so I used to go up there and spend a couple of days, and I would bring all my images. And not unlike printmaking, I'd make small proofs so I could see if there were any mistakes and have to make color corrections, things like that. But I never handled, I never got to touch the press, the printer. And it's all mechanized. And then Epson started, more artists got interested in this, and Epson started making larger printers. And Epsons really are this, I believe, and I'm not alone, the state-of-the-art printer for this kind of work. I work on a 24-inch wide printer that you can feed a roll of paper into, so it could be endless. I can make Henry Dargers. There is an Epson printer that's 44 inches wide. Can't afford that. The one I have, it's not mine. I don't own it. I don't print enough to own a printer like that. The ink heads clog all the time. But I got a grant and got one for school so the students can use it. And I was paying for those 22 by 30s, I was paying about $150 a print just to have them printed. And for the kids now and for me to print that's probably 12 to 15 bucks. It's a pretty good deal. Plus now there are all kinds of paper to print on that are coded for digital printing. Tons of things have changed. So that coding means that it helps the ink, it keeps the ink from soaking into the paper. The way the ink is sprayed, and you're dealing with a cotton fiber paper, you really don't see it, but if you print on an uncoated paper, everything blurs slightly. And my feeling is if you want it blurred, your image should be blurred when you're making your image. It shouldn't be because of the way, the technical aspect is something wrong. So when you can't see the coating on the paper, but it prints sharp and crisp. It also helps keep the printer heads from clogging because of the paper fibers. And there are all kinds of paper. I mean, you all know about photographic paper. You know, and most photographers are printing things digitally too. I mean, there's still some wet work, but most of the photography that you see is digitally printed. And these printers are made for photographers. But there's a lot of watercolor type paper, soft cotton paper. Some papers are coated on both sides so that you can do, you know, different kinds of things that way. There are Japanese papers. There are mylar-like papers so that you can print off a black, you know, a pure black to run through, you know, with a photographic process for printmaking. There are fabrics you can buy. Digitally printed fabric is a huge thing now. And probably the most intense and wonderful stuff I've seen was at the Alexander McQueen show that was called Savage Beauty. It was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art a couple of years ago, the way he used digital imagery, you know, in designing the clothing. I mean, and there's a catalog, it's to die for. But there's a company, primarily a company in California that has, gosh, I've got samples, I buy samples of all this stuff for my students, probably 60 different kinds of fabrics, everything from the outdoor banner stuff to fake leather to canvas to fine silk gauze that's so transparent you can barely see it. And that's all stretched on paper so you can run it through the printer. It's all coated. They make 2 different kinds so you can actually make clothing out of it. Yeah, big printers. That 27 or that 24-inch printer is about $7,000. The 17-inch wide printer, you can get a used one. Like it's a 4000 series. Epson 4000 series is the 17-inch. 7000 series is the 24-inch, and 9000 series is the 44-inch. And you can buy used ones, you can buy repurposed ones. I'm sure there's people around town that'll be happy to print for you, but you'll pay over $100 to print it. And don't ever print or use one with a RIP, an RIP on it. Just trust me, if you're an artist. There's a lot of sort of technology skill in terms of learning how to use the printer and how to calibrate the monitor in the printer so that you get what you thought you had. It's that separation like with the lithograph again in a slightly different way. More than you wanted to know?
No, I think it's really great that you can print on different materials too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So the paper becomes part of the piece.
Yeah.
I love my big printer. I'm so happy. Uh-oh, this is my performance piece now. Any other questions? That's it? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, were you able to share any of your pieces about your mother with her? And if so, did that affect on subsequent pieces?
That would be about the last thing on earth I would have ever done, with or without Alzheimer's. My mother getting Alzheimer's was really in a horrible way a gift, because all of the negativity and anger that she harbored most of her life magically disappeared along with her memory. But she became a really sweet old lady, and it's the only time I ever had with my mom. This is a little TMI here. That was really pleasurable. So that was the little gift in the middle of the horror, but no, I would not have shared it with her. No way. I did share some of the images with other members of my family. My parents were divorced when I was about 30. At one point, I brought the little proofs back to New York, and my brother was there, my dad, my cousin, people that knew her. And there's images of my aunts in there, my grandmother, a great-grandmother. They're mostly women. My dad got very quiet. He looked, everything got passed around the giant dining table. He got very quiet, and he went to bed right away. You know, my cousin was totally blown away. My stepsister, who I've known now for almost as long as Marna, she wanted to know who everybody was, wanted to know all the stories, you know, and this is family. It's different than showing in a gallery. And then I had work in a gallery at, gosh, I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the school. It's in New Jersey, though. It's like within driving distance of New York. And I did invite my father and my cousin and my stepsister. My brother's not in New York. And it was, I think it was an eight-person show, 6-person show, and then there was an artist talk after. Sorry. So the pieces, they were all, the flat pieces. This is a while ago. I don't know. I think mostly my dad was really proud to see me in that kind of professional setting. And that was what he focused on. He never talked about the work. And they never, when he and my stepmom set up house, they came into my studio. They were like an army of ants. I mean, they walked in empty-handed, and my stepmom walked out with this pile of prints. It's just like, whoa, what happened? And that's fine, But they've never asked, and then since every time like a new series would start, she'd always want something, and they've never asked for any of these. But no, my mom did not see them. It's a very reasonable question. Oh, God. No. Jesus. Anything else? Thanks again. I really appreciate your... I'm free, you're not.